The order was given, the bugle sounded, and 600 horsemen lowered their sabers as they spurred forward. The thunder of hooves shook the valley floor, each stride carrying them deeper into the smoke and roar of Russian artillery. Cannon fire erupted from three sides, shells bursting overhead, and iron balls ripping into the ranks. Horses screamed, men fell, yet the line pressed on. Officers shouted over the chaos, urging their men into the storm. The Light Brigade was charging, not against infantry or retreating soldiers, but directly into the jaws of a Russian gun line. What began as an order carried in haste would be remembered as one of the most disastrous and legendary cavalry charges in history. The year was 1854, the Crimean War in its second year. Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire had joined together against Russia, determined to check its expansion into the Black Sea and toward the Mediterranean. The focal point was the Crimean Peninsula, where the Allies laid siege to Sevastopol, Russia's naval base on the Black Sea. In October, the armies clashed at Balaclava, a port town that served as the British supply base. The Russians launched an attack aimed at cutting the British line in two and seizing the harbor. The battle would unfold in several phases, but it is remembered above all for the moment when miscommunication sealed the fate of the Light Brigade. The British cavalry in Crimea was divided into two brigades. The Heavy Brigade, composed of larger men on heavy horses, specialized in smashing through enemy cavalry. The Light Brigade, mounted on faster horses, was designed for scouting, skirmishing, and pursuing broken forces. They were not meant to face concentrated artillery head-on, yet under Lord Cardigan, the Light Brigade would be sent to do exactly that. During the morning of October 25th, Russian forces captured Turkish-held redoubts armed with artillery on the hills overlooking the valley. British commander Lord Raglan, observing from high ground, wanted the cavalry to prevent the Russians from carrying off the captured guns. His staff drafted the order, vague and hurried. It was carried by Captain Lewis Nolan, a fiery officer known for his impatience with incompetence. The message delivered to Lord Lucan, commander of the cavalry, read, "Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front and try to prevent the enemy from carrying away the guns." To Raglan, the guns referred to the redoubts on the heights. To Lucan and Cardigan, standing down in the valley with no clear view of Raglan's position, the nearest guns were at the far end of the valley. Heavily fortified Russian artillery supported by infantry on both sides. When Lucan asked Nolan for clarification, Nolan gestured vaguely down the valley. Whether through haste, contempt, or misunderstanding, Nolan's signal pointed the Light Brigade toward the Russian gun line. The fatal mistake was set. At around 11 a.m., Lord Cardigan drew his sword and led his men forward. The Light Brigade formed ranks, about 670 strong, sabers gleaming in the cold sun. The Russian gunners on the far end of the valley prepared their pieces, and those on the ridges to either side trained their weapons on the advancing horsemen. As the brigade began its gallop, Russian batteries opened fire. Shells exploded overhead, canister shot whistled through the air, and solid round shot plowed into horse and rider alike. Men were blown from their saddles, horses toppled, yet the survivors pressed forward, maintaining their line as best they could. Witnesses described the charge as magnificent and terrible, a spectacle of courage driving straight into futility. Captain Nolan, the officer who had delivered the order, was among the first to die. A shell fragment struck him in the chest, and he fell with his arm raised, as if trying to redirect the charge even in his last moment. Still the brigade advanced, sabers flashing as they closed the distance. The Russian gunners at the far end were astonished at the sight of cavalry riding directly into their muzzles. They fired again and again, but when the Light Brigade reached the battery, the survivors leapt among the guns, cutting down gunners and fighting hand to hand. For a brief, chaotic moment, they held the Russian position. But without reinforcements, Surrounded and under fire from all sides, they could not remain. The order was given to withdraw. The ride back was as bloody as the ride in. Of the roughly 670 men who began the charge, 110 were killed, more than 160 wounded, and nearly 375 horses lost. Less than half of the brigade returned intact. The Russians stood in disbelief, shaken not by the tactical outcome, but by the sheer audacity of the charge. A Russian officer later wrote that it was not war, but madness. Even the Russians cheered the courage of the men who had charged into certain death. The aftermath of the charge was filled with bitter recrimination. Lord Raglan insisted his order had been clear and that Lucan and Cardigan had misinterpreted it. Lucan blamed Nolan's gestures, while Cardigan insisted he had simply obeyed orders as given. The rivalry between Lucan and Cardigan, brothers-in-law who despised each other, fueled the confusion. Both men survived the charge and spent years defending their reputations. Nolan, the one man who might have clarified the fatal miscommunication, was dead on the field. News of the charge electrified Britain. War correspondents with the Times relayed the story home, and Alfred, Lord Tennyson, immortalized the event in his poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, with its famous refrain, "Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die." The charge became both a symbol of military folly and of extraordinary valor. For the British public, it was a reminder of the bravery of common soldiers too often sacrificed to the incompetence of their commanders. In military terms, the charge achieved nothing. The Russians held the captured redoubts, and the Battle of Balaclava ended indecisively. Yet the charge of the Light Brigade entered legend. It highlighted both the risks of unclear communication in battle and the unflinching discipline of soldiers who followed orders even when they led to death. For the men who survived, it was a memory they carried for the rest of their lives, etched in fire and smoke. Today, the charge remains one of the most studied and remembered episodes of the Crimean War. Memorials stand to honor the fallen, and historians continue to debate the exact sequence of decisions that led to the disaster. But the image endures. A thin line of cavalry galloping into the mouth of Russian guns, sabers raised, courage undiminished, even as death swept through their ranks. The charge of the Light Brigade was not a victory, but it became immortal. A single mistake turned into legend, a moment when duty and courage met miscommunication and tragedy, echoing across time as both cautionary tale and testament to the men who rode into fire. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.